This video is going to be more personal than you're probably used to on this channel. It might even be a little more amusing as a result. I often hear from people who say they really like it when I get a little more personal with anecdotes, and my wife is always telling me that I need to get more candid and personal in my videos, so fine, here it is. Here are some stories from my personal life that relate back to my experience of what it's like to be a Catholic. But with all of that said, I plan to share what I consider to be some of my worst experiences as a Catholic. And I'm doing so not because this is just some cathartic opportunity to complain about bad experiences. I think we can learn a lot from the stories like this about things we shouldn't be doing and maybe some of the things that we could be correcting as a church. And admittedly, some of these things we don't really have control over, but for the ones that we do, this is some low-hanging fruit that we could easily address if we want to be more missionary and more welcoming as a church. I also don't want to just glory in the details of bad experiences and negativity, so I'm also going to be sharing what I would consider my best experiences as a Catholic. So my introduction to Catholicism came through what you might call charismatic circles in the church. And if you don't know what that is, it's what you might think of when you think of like Pentecostalism. It consists of a much greater emphasis on spiritual and mystical experiences, especially those inspired by the Holy Spirit. Now, one of the very first Catholic events that I attended was at a charismatic prayer meeting, and there was some praise and worship, some people playing guitars and singing songs, and then there was a speaker. And then after the speaker, there was a more intense time of praise and worship in which people really started to let down their filters. Eventually, everyone in the room was doing what they called speaking in tongues. Now, I didn't know what this was or why people were doing it, but I will say I was turned off by it. I was personally embarrassed because I couldn't participate, and I certainly didn't want to participate in whatever was going on. And from the outside looking in, it did not lend much credibility to this religion that I was exploring for the first time. It looked, from my perspective, like people descending into an emotional frenzy in which their reason and their minds had been evicted in favor of some kind of a spiritual intoxication. Now, I'm not commenting on the legitimacy of that. I'm just explaining what that experience was like for someone who had no concept of what was going on. As a newcomer, that was not the kind of environment I should have been introduced to, in my opinion. And interestingly enough, St. Paul actually talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. In verse 23, he says that if you all insist on getting together and speaking in tongues, and then an outsider comes in, he'll think you've lost your minds, which is what I thought. Earlier in the chapter, he says that speaking in tongues is a way of speaking to God, but it's not for the edification of the church when there's a pluralistic gathering of people. It's just for you as a way to pray with your spirit. But prophecy, which is another gift of the Spirit, is the one that he emphasizes as being greater and more appropriate for these kinds of gatherings. He says it's what we should use to edify each other and evangelize outsiders. And prophecy here in this context means like a word of instruction that doesn't really disregard our rational minds and faculties. It's not some kind of crystal ball magic trick intoxication of the Spirit. So the lesson here should be, when we gather together to edify the church, let's be conscientious about what edifies others and not just ourselves as individuals. The second story happened during a marriage prep retreat with my now wife that everyone is forced to take without exception or qualification. And already I find this notion to be kind of problematic. If you're someone who is actively participating in the life of your church along with your betrothed, your pastor should know you and be willing to sit down with you as a couple to assess your fitness for the sacrament of marriage. And if he finds that you need some instruction, then great, he can encourage you to go do something like a marriage prep weekend. But in our case, we really didn't find this weekend retreat instructive or edifying. It largely consisted of talks given to us by lay people for whom this really wasn't their great talent or strength. In fact, at the beginning, they admitted to us that public speaking wasn't their thing and it made them nervous, so they were going to opt to just read to us what they had to say. And they weren't kidding. This wasn't the kind of like Toastmasters training where you learn to read a little bit and make eye contact with the people and then back. They were just like faces on scripts the entire time, reading in a monotonous voice. Now, bear in mind that many of the people who come to these retreats are not practicing Catholics. They're people who want to have like a nice church wedding, but they're otherwise indifferent towards the Catholic religion. So this is an evangelistic opportunity. This is a moment in which we as a church could shine and impress. But instead, we force people to sacrifice a weekend to listen to people who are not specially suited to this task read scripts to us all weekend long. And if that wasn't bad enough, they also insisted on pairing their speeches with homemade imagery. For one of these themes, they rolled out a kind of bulletin board on wheels, which had been decorated with felt imagery depicting Oscar the Grouch announcing in the most infantile bubble letter script the very profound and inspired platitude that God doesn't make junk. Okay. So one of the big adversities we have to fight against as a church is the perception that faith is for children. It's something that you should grow out of as you become an adult. That to be a church-going person is to indulge in something infantile, which is something I couldn't disagree with more, but it's pretty hard to disagree with when we do things like this. The retreat leaders obviously thought, hey, let's make this more engaging, more relevant. But their solution was Sesame Street characters reciting infantile slogans when your target audience is young adults? How is this possible? This is the faith, this is the creed that produced Michelangelo's Pieta, the works of Caravaggio, and the music of Palestrina. And this isn't an isolated thing. Our websites, our logos, our bulletins, our vestments most of the time, the way we decorate our churches all seem to carry this kind of childish aesthetic. We are not doing ourselves any favors when we do this kind of thing. It's not enhancing our creed or making our culture more attractive. We have to stop doing this. All of these liturgical committees and sanctuary decorating committees, they just need to be dismissed. It would be better if we did nothing than what typically passes as decorative enhancements in your average Catholic church today. The next story happened back when I was a music leader at Mass. I used to play guitar and lead a band who would provide the musical supplement at Mass. This is something I was recruited for shortly after converting to the Catholic Church because I was known as someone who had played in hard rock bands in my youth. And if nothing else will convince you that guitars at Mass are a bad idea, maybe this will. So during this particular Mass, I was struggling a little bit with some indigestion, and depending on the kind of guitar you're using, you will either have like a microphone pointed straight at it or a pickup that's built inside of the guitar. And I can't really remember which one I had at this point, but all I know is that at one point my stomach growled ferociously and then was subsequently broadcast over the entire sound system during a moment of silence during the liturgy. And once it was processed through that sound system, it wasn't really clear what it was, but it was obvious that it was some kind of bodily biological function. And of course, because it had resounded through the entire church, it also wasn't clear where it came from. Anyone near a microphone was a suspect at this point, but needless to say, I was not thrilled about that experience. The next story is unfortunately a little less amusing. It took place on I can't remember if it was Passion Sunday or Palm Sunday, but it was during that period of COVID in which there were restrictions on how many people could attend Mass. Restrictions which were not only fully adhered to where I lived, but even enthusiastically superseded by many of the parishes. Now, between the last Sunday that we had attended and this particular Sunday, they had implemented a registration system at this parish so that you couldn't attend Mass unless you pre-registered. We didn't know about this, and so after getting all of our 7 kids dressed up for Mass, nice and early, we arrived to find a line all the way out the door directing towards what looked like a TSA checkpoint that everyone had to go through in order to be let into the building. By the time we arrived at this checkpoint, we were asked our names, and then that was compared to a list of what was obviously registrants. At this point, we were informed that only people who had pre-registered were allowed into Mass, and that because we were such a large family, we would be far too much a liability if they let us in. So at this point, we're obviously heartbroken, hurt, and embarrassed. And to add insult to injury, we then proceeded to do a walk of shame back to our car in front of all the privileged few who were going to be allowed in to receive God's exclusive blessing, apparently. And by the way, just so there's no confusion, this was not the Latin Mass, which we more frequently attend, and many people know that we attend the Latin Mass. Now, I'm not going to launch into a vitriolic criticism of everything we did wrong during COVID, but I will say that if you find yourself in a position in which you are denying perfectly healthy people access to the sacraments because some secular bureaucracy told you to, then you have to admit that you've taken a wrong turn somewhere. If you're refusing families with children access to Jesus, the same Jesus who would touch and cleanse lepers, the one who said that if you cause any of these children to stumble, it would be better for you to be drowned in the sea. If that's you, if you find yourself doing that, then something has gone terribly wrong in the church. Families left the church over what happened during COVID, and I don't see a lot of soul searching or effort to come to terms with the fact that serious sins against charity and serious mistakes were made, let alone apologies and a willingness to consider apologizing for those mistakes. Now, this next one is a little bit hyperbolic. This is not one of my worst experiences, but it is one of those things that makes me ask, why do we do this? And that is navigating the phalanx of greeters who are prepared to shake your hand and welcome you into the Catholic Church when you first walk in. Why do we think this is a good idea? I imagine that the answer is because we want to make people feel welcome. That's a nice sentiment, but you can't manufacture welcome and have it be anything other than an insincere contrivance. And this is a perfect example. It's like when I walk into Walmart and they have paid employees greet me, I don't feel sincerely welcomed. My heart is not warmed by that experience. If anything, I feel kind of annoyed, like there's some ulterior motive going on here. And if we are doing this for people who are new, can we be more honest about this? Most people don't want to have to negotiate an awkward social situation with a stranger with a name tag at the moment they walk into a church for the first time. Maybe this is a nice thing for some people, but it's a big turnoff for a large enough sample of the population that we should not be doing it. And the last worst experience that I could think of was the summer of 2021, in which dozens of Canadian churches were vandalized and set on fire as a response to news headlines carried around the world claiming that mass graves of Indigenous children were discovered at former Catholic boarding schools, proving that the church was involved in a systematic genocidal campaign. Eventually, that narrative was drawn back and scaled back a little bit to say, well, it wasn't mass graves, it was unmarked graves. Although some venues are actually still carrying that narrative, these were mass graves. Now, some 2 years later, not a single body has been discovered. The original reports were based on ground-penetrating radar surveys that had been conducted, which only reveal soil disturbances. That's all they show. If you've ever actually looked at the imagery that a ground-penetrating radar survey produces, it's just little squiggly lines in the ground. They certainly don't show graves or bodies or x-rays of skeletons in the ground. So to say that children's graves, unequivocally, children's graves were uncovered was entirely speculative and unsubstantiated. And yet, in a few places where they actually bothered to try to exhume those supposedly ghastly discoveries, so far they have discovered nothing. But that didn't stop mainstream news media outlets from uncritically repeating that children's graves had been discovered, even though disturbed soil in apple orchards was all that had actually been discovered. And the next thing we know, crowds of violent protesters were abusing Catholics as they went to church, vandalizing our monuments and burning our churches down, while some high-profile government officials actually cheered them on. And not a single suspect that I know of was caught. There was a beautiful historical church, probably one of the most beautiful churches in the province I live in, about 15 minutes away from where I live, that was burned to the ground. No suspects. What can you do? Can't find them. But if I so much as sneeze on a rainbow-covered crosswalk, you better believe they are going to make an example of me. What this taught me was how eager people were to believe any story that could be contrived to make Catholics and the church look evil. It's almost as if people have been looking for any excuse to adopt that conclusion, and this not only gave them the ammunition to adopt that conclusion, but also the incentive to take criminal action against Catholics. Okay, so those are my worst experiences. What about some of my best? The first has to be my reception into the Catholic Church at the Easter Vigil when I received my first communion and my confirmation. I had been waiting for the ability to participate fully in the life of the church for a long time at this point, so finally being able to receive communion every time I went to Mass was the fulfillment of a lot of longing. Another experience that I just absolutely treasure as a Catholic is those few opportunities I've had to witness people receiving the sacrament of the sick. This is a sacrament that not a lot of people are familiar with, and one I've never received myself, But like I said, I have been there with people who have received it, and I've witnessed cases that were described as medically hopeless turn a corner after that sacrament was received. Now, it's not a sacrament that guarantees physical healing, but it does happen. And short of that, it will provide spiritual healing. So I can't recommend it enough. And it's not the kind of sacrament you just wait until you're on your deathbed. Anytime you are suffering from some severe illness, it's worth getting. The next has to be getting married. For obvious reasons, I was looking forward to getting married. But what I didn't anticipate was this spiritual high of grace that I would experience for months afterward. You know those periods where you just feel like you are incredibly close to God? That's what life was like for me in the immediate aftermath of receiving that sacrament. The next one has to be seeing my kids adopt the faith with enthusiasm and in measures that put me to shame. I'm just amazed at the times where I will catch one of my kids praying the rosary on their own, or reading spiritual literature, or even something like singing ancient Latin chants while they do their chores, like do the dishes or clean the house. The next one is going to confession, and not any particular instance I have in mind, just every time. I always come away with a huge burden lifted from my mind and my soul. It's always so encouraging to know that when things start to get a little bit heavy, I'm probably due for some penance, and I honestly can't imagine how people get through life without experiencing that kind of relief when they need it. The last one has to be going to the Latin Mass for the first time, and I'm not going to go into great detail about this because I made a whole video right after I did it, which I'll try to remember to link to either in the description or one of the pop-outs on YouTube. But I will say that I was so dumbstruck by the almost paradoxical atmosphere in which people were so intensely devoted to the act of worship while simultaneously conducting themselves with an air of, I don't know, just casual, like childish liberty almost. It's hard to explain, but it wasn't this rigid, uptight society that I was anticipating. And furthermore, I was amazed at how friendly everyone was. People came up to me and introduced themselves, and it wasn't because that was their assigned job. They were just sincerely living out their calling to be missionary disciples of Jesus, loving their neighbors. So forgive me for saying something that should be kind of obvious, but we as Catholics should be looking out for one another in the secular world. And I would say especially in the business world, in the professional sphere of our lives. And I don't think that we do this enough. Catholics should be using Catholic businesses for their goods and services. Catholics should be hiring other Catholics. And Catholic business leaders should be supporting and collaborating with one another, especially in a time when the values and the winds of the world are not blowing in a very sympathetic direction. This is what Fisher's network is trying to build, a network of Catholic economic leaders who can establish this kind of landscape for Catholics to better support each other. We form groups of business leaders at a parish level so that they can establish rich friendships and then help each other grow personally and especially professionally. And then once having shored up one another's economic success, they can turn their attention to better supporting the needs of the parish and the community at large. And pastors are joining these groups too as chaplains in order to help provide spiritual direction for the economic leaders in their communities, but also to get the business mentorship that they need so that if there's an HR issue, a construction issue, or a financial concern, they now have a network of business leaders that they can turn to for advice and support. So if you're a Catholic business owner, an executive, an artist, a politician, a school administrator, or a leader in any other professional capacity, consider starting your own crew or joining one now by visiting fishersnetwork.com.